Hello, everyone. Welcome to AVAIYA University's Healing from Childhood Trauma. I am Ande Anderson. My partner, Ike Allen, and I are the founders of AVAIYA University and Enlightenment Village. Thanks so much for being here. And in this event, we're talking with some really incredible fellow experts. We're talking with psychologists, therapists, podcasters, doctors, authors, and more about how to heal from your experiences of childhood trauma. And today our guest is going to be talking about gifts of your traumatic past. So please welcome Dr. Anna Baranowsky. Hi there.
Hi, Andy. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
I'm so glad to have you here. I'm so excited to dive into this topic in your work. And I want to share a little bit about what you're up to in the world and all the work that you do first, and then we'll dive in. So Anna is a Canadian clinical psychologist and the founder and CEO of the Traumatology Institute. She works with trauma survivors and those with post-traumatic stress disorder on post-traumatic growth and recovery. She also provides training for organizations and professionals who help trauma survivors and is the author of the bestseller called Trauma Practice: Tools for Stabilization and Recovery, as well as What is PTSD? 3 Steps to Healing Trauma, which was a 2013 International Book Award finalist. So, given all of that, I would love it if you would just get us started by sharing a little bit about how did you get into the work that you do today, Anna?
You know, that is actually a great question. The real truth of the matter, and I think this is why the title of what we're talking about today, Gifts of Your Traumatic Past, is so important, is that my exposure to trauma started a long time before I actually helped anybody on the scene of a crash or, a bank robbery site, or in my office when, somebody's coming in after being exposed to something terrible on their own. The reality is that, my own family of origin had experienced massive trauma. And, that laid kind of the underpinning of me being very interested in, what happens when somebody's traumatized. I mean, I remember my, sweet dad, suffering a lot when I was growing up. And we used to go for these walks, and, he would, finally, after many years of me saying, Dad, what happened to you? What really happened? Started to open up and tell me about, these terrible things that had happened to him and his family. And, my mom had also experienced some awful things when she was growing up. And, it shapes a child to grow up in an environment like that, where, specifically where you are in a situation and you can see the suffering of those around you, particularly, when you love those people and you care for them and you see their pain and suffering. And it really built inside of me this deep, deep resonance with what happens with trauma survivors, but also a longing to understand what would make a difference, what would help. Because, when I was growing up, trauma work and therapy, this really wasn't something that was happening to any large degree. People weren't talking about it much. They weren't doing the work. They didn't have mechanisms that really made a difference. And when I finally went to school, I had these very interesting experiences where I would get referred these clients, and they often seem to have pretty significant traumas. And then my supervisors would frequently say to me, oh, you shouldn't have been referred that client. That's a very difficult case. And, but, carry on because you seem to be doing okay, right? And it really made me very aware that I had to spend some time and understand, what was this? What happened to people when they'd experienced trauma? How deep did it go? And what was the impact going forward? And, one of the things that really made me realize that, a trauma can impact us in very many different ways is that I could see that even though my father had been so severely traumatized, he had this like real sweetness about him. And I realized that, he'd grown up in a family until he was 12 years old. He was with his family, who were very, very loving, and that laid an infrastructure for him that, even though the most horrendous things happened to him from the age of 12 onwards, for many years during his teen years, he'd actually had so much sweetness in his life that, after he was able to, be like a really sweet dad and very loving and kind and show a lot of, the good qualities that a father would need to, even though he'd experienced so much difficulty. And I mean, not saying that he didn't suffer. I mean, he suffered greatly, but there was this genetic component, and also what he'd been exposed to. So both nurture and nature were playing into, who he was and how he navigated massive trauma. And, that's really, really important to realize that, you can be exposed to terrible things and you can come out of it okay, or you can start to recognize that there is an infrastructure that can be built internally when you've been exposed to massive trauma, or when your family has been exposed to massive trauma. So, I mean, one of the things that I noticed, for myself, growing up in a family where there was massive trauma, was that my parents wanted to teach me to be safe. And one of the ways in which they taught me to be safe was to basically tell me that, speaking up, having a voice, being visible, that was not safe. And that became part of my infrastructure. That meant that I had to really work with my own voice to be able to learn how to feel safe sharing. And joining into the larger human community was a very important thing, very big part of that. And also being able to see how that infrastructure was alive inside of all of us, that infrastructure of pain and suffering, however it's built inside of you, will follow you along. And so learning different ways of facing that infrastructure and working with it so that it doesn't have as big as an impact on you. Like, what are the lessons that you learned, or what were the lessons that were transferred to you genetically or through the epigenetics? And I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. Become a very, very important piece of how you navigate your life, but also what could potentially be your gifts. Because I look at this history, the history that came through my family, as part of my gift, because it allowed me to really see where the wounds were and what I needed to learn in order to be the person that I needed to be, the person who I was supposed to be. And I look at this as evolution. When we take the opportunity to become who we're really meant to be, we often have to face our historical past. What we learned through our families, what came through epigenetics, and who we are today, the places where the wounds are still alive.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And it's so interesting, right? You came out of a family that your parents both had traumatic events. So, right, the safety thing, that really rings true to me, right? That you were taught in certain ways to be safe, and then that affected and influenced your journey. And I love how you've evolved since then, in having your voice and all the work that you're doing in the world because of that. So I love that. So could you give a little brief overview of what epigenetics is for people who don't know?
So this is such an interesting area, and it's a fairly new area of research. So one of the things, you can hear my dog, he's whining in the background. He just made a big, he's actually just fallen asleep.
Mine is over here too. She's also asleep.
Epigenetics is an emerging area of scientific research that shows how environmental influences, children's experiences, let's say, actually affect the expression of genes. And this means that, there was an idea that genes, like, they're set in stone, but, the reality is that is actually now disproven. And we really know that it's nature, this idea of nature versus nurture, it's not really the case any longer. We have to actually always look at both, because, for example, what I said before about what happened with my dad, he grew up in a really supportive family, very creative, very spiritual, very warm. And then he was exposed to like the most horrific trauma you could imagine. And he was able to take both what he had experienced, the nourishment, as well as what he'd been exposed to, the trauma, and both of those things played into shaping who he was going forward, because he did develop PTSD, and that doesn't surprise me because, you know, his trauma was very enormous. And then as a child, I think I benefited from the love and the warmth that he had experienced. That's epigenetics, because it's like that past, the warmth and the kindness, the sense of like sharing a warm emotional space was part of that upbringing. But I was also very, very aware of his version of the world, which was, this world is a very dangerous place, and these are the things you need to do to stay safe. So, you know, that's really epigenetics pouring into who I am. And then, you know, learning about all of those things can be very helpful for, you know, for any of you, you know, the viewers today, to recognize that, you know, it could be, you know, both the beautiful things that come from the generations that came before, as well as the difficult things that are shared, as well as the positive things. So, for example, if you had, let's say, a grandmother who was born into a very troubled family, but was adopted by a very kind and supportive family, you may benefit from her genes. Mm-hmm. You know, whereas if she stayed with, let's say, a family which was very troubled and dysfunctional, and where there was, you know, a lot of difficulties with abuse, you may struggle with some of the things that come up as a result of that. And I think it's really useful. One of the things that we do in our training programs is we get people to do traumograms. Like, they're genograms, but they're traumograms. And I have people kind of look at what happened to your grandparents or your great-grandparents, your parents, yourself. You know, how is it that their stories, you know, whatever they might be, pour into your life today? So, for example, one woman was telling me, you know, in a clinical setting, that she was always terrified of fire. And we did a genogram, and it turned out that, in fact, in this case, her grandmother had lost everything in a family fire. It was a very dangerous situation. There was almost loss of life. You know, there was, you know, a lot of terror in that event. And, you know, she had never really put the pieces together. But one of the homework assignments that I had given her in our clinical work was, you know, to go and start to collect, you know, the history, you know, what's happened to you in your life, what's happened to your parents, your aunts and uncles, your cousins, your grandparents, and kind of really looking at your life through that lens can be incredibly helpful, because all of a sudden you can start to understand what might pour into the present. Now, there's some interesting research on epigenetics, and it's worth mentioning that, you know, in human studies, it's very hard to really track it, because, you know, we have human generations in, you know, 20 and 30 years, whereas a lot of the early research on epigenetics looks at, in terms of animals, looks at mice, and, you know, their generations look like every 30 to 40 days or so. And so you end up being able to track things. And if a mouse is exposed in one generation, the first generation, let's call it, to a stressor that's paired with, let's say, a scent or some kind of stimuli, then 2 and 3 generations later, if that mouse, the offspring of the first generation, is exposed to the same stimuli without the stressor, without it being a difficult, stressful event, let's say just a scent or a sound with no associated stressor, that animal will respond as if they are being exposed to something stressful.
Got it.
And so we have to recognize that, you know, these kinds of things can pour through the generations, and that it's meaningful to know what your history is, and it's meaningful to put it within the context of the fact that we have a kind of internal infrastructure of beliefs and patterns and mechanisms for dealing with our lives, and we rely on that infrastructure, you know, to make decisions, to keep us well, to make new choices, you know, to figure out what our next step in life is. And, you know, when we're dealing with an infrastructure, when we're using an infrastructure that may have been something that kept our parents or our grandparents safe, or something we learned when we were 6 years old, it really may not serve us today. And if we did some reflection on the areas of our lives where we struggle, or we sense that things are not going as they should or as well as they could, or I'm being reactive in places where there's really no danger, we need to really spend time with that, because that's coming from a place where old infrastructure is determining how we're going to respond to our lives today. And you can see how that could steal from who we can be.
Hi there, this is Ike Allen, founder of AVAIYA. I wanted to take a moment and pause the masterclass to remind you that you can experience many more teachers in the free masterclass at avaiya.com/healing. That's AVAIYA.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know a lot of people who've dealt with traumas as children can be very reactive and get, reactive to even the littlest of things. So do you have suggestions on how to not do that, or how do we work with our responses and reactions to things?
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, let's understand that, I mean, you're bringing up even a different element, which is somebody who's been exposed to their own trauma, not necessarily the things that came from previous generations, but right. I would say that it's not only what comes from your own history, but also what comes from previous generations. Like, I think these things combine to make our vulnerability greater. And, you know, the reality is we've all come from, cave dwellers, basically, running away from saber-toothed tigers, right? I mean, we need to have a strong and reactive nervous system that can ignite fight or flight so we can get out of danger quickly. So this is actually a good thing, that we can respond. It's just not useful when it's old trauma that has been unresolved. So I really strongly encourage people to find a good local therapist, or, kind of work deeply on the mechanisms that can help to shine light on those areas that are unresolved. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but you know what? I think I'm going to show you something first, because it demonstrates something really well.
Okay.
These beads. I love these beads. They were brought to my office by somebody who had visited their family in Africa, and I just love these beads. But the really interesting thing about these is they very well represent what might happen if we're exposed to a traumatic event from the past. So if you look at all the beads here, and you just contemplate that every bead could be a trauma, because many of us have been exposed to many, many things in the course of our life, correct? I mean, it's not just one thing.
Oh, yeah.
However, if we've got a whole bead full of really difficult experiences, the problem is that these experiences from the past get stored in our brain in a very particular way that makes any bead, any current trauma will shake up the whole chain.
Got it.
But even more significant is it doesn't have to be a trauma. It could be a reminder of the trauma. It could be something that just evoked a conversation you had. It could be seeing a certain color or car, or hearing a sound, or having a conversation, or having a lower level stressful event. So what could happen is, let's say you get onto a bus and the bus driver is very unkind to you for whatever reason, or, you know, starts to move the bus before you've really, you know, you've sat down and you almost fall and you feel really shaken up. So that would be, let's say this little bead here.
Uh-huh.
Bead here is today's event. However, if these are all the other ones, if I shake this, the whole thing shakes. And that's really what happened.
Got it.
A current event. So what ends up happening is, if all these other beads are linked in our minds, in our brains, right, in our memory. So there's two brain areas to think of. The hippocampus, which really is about memory storage, and the amygdala, which is all about emotional power and content. So the amygdala and the hippocampus they're very close together in the brain. And what happens is, if I have a memory, it will be stored with the emotional content. And if something within inside of me evokes that emotion, everything on the chain gets ignited, and all the memories that really cause the most distress for us can get very active.
Mm-hmm.
Now we got problems.
Right.
Because it's not just about this moment in time with the bus driver. It's now about everything that came before. And now I have a really big problem because I'm seriously ignited, and all that's happened is a low-level event, an event that really, in the greater scheme of things, would not normally have caused so much trouble for us.
Right.
So what that means is that it becomes very crucial. It actually becomes crucial for us to do our deeper trauma work, to identify what are the historical wounds
Mm-hmm.
that are unresolved. And I like working with a target list of memories, and really just creating them as a, you know, keeping guardrails in place. So it's like maybe 7 to 10 words to identify a real thing that has happened, and then a timeline, and a context. You know, when did that thing happen? Where did that thing happen? You don't have to be absolutely precise with the timeline. You know, sometimes you could just say, oh, you know, 10 years ago in the summer, or, you know, in my backyard of the family home.
Mm-hmm.
7 to 10 words are important because we want them to be as precise as possible, so that what we're doing is we're really laying out what has occurred. We're being precise so we can capture it.
Mm-hmm.
If we have like 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 or 35, because some people have quite a few unresolved moments in life, we then rate them all, and then we identify the themes that go along with them, because we can work on resolving specific memories. And I'll talk for a moment about different strategies to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, even once we have resolved the specific memories, we can be in trouble because we're left with certain themes. So certain themes could be things like, I'm unlovable.
Got it.
You know, life is unfair. You know, I'll always be alone. You know, always be poor. You know, things like that. That, like, belief systems that we now are carrying with us that are really driving how we see ourselves in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be very problematic, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and we want to really be able to be aware of how that could impact us.
Got it.
So one of the things to be aware of is that, you know, with these awarenesses, there are really, really strategic things that we can do. And I use a triphasic model. What does that mean? I always use a triphasic model, and that's what both of my books were based on.
Mm-hmm.
trauma practice, as well as what is PTSD. What is PTSD was written for the public, because it was really about making sure that, you know, we had ways of looking at the impact on ourselves, and understanding that we always need to start with, you know, stabilizing, harnessing calm. And for people who are interested, you know, I'm talking about What is PTSD, the book, but I'm also talking about the triphasic online program, the trauma recovery program, which is at whatisptsd.com. We start with stabilization or harnessing calm. We start with things like breathing and meditating, progressive muscle relaxation. I do an exercise called Shake to Release, paced breathing. I use exercises like inhaling soft as a feather and exhaling heavy as sand, so that we get a visceral inner experience to focus on, because that takes us to that more grounded place. I use different strategies like hand over heart space, which is a really, really lovely exercise to help people really find a way to be with inside of themselves once they've been triggered by something. You want to be able to lower the volume of stress, because what that does is it helps us to be friendlier with those moments that we've been triggered. And the more often we respond to ourselves from a place of kindness and compassion when we've been triggered, when we've been ignited, the more we send the corrective message. One, in this moment I am safe. And two, I can face this and bear witness to my raw emotions with kindness and calm. That's a game changer, right? So that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. So the next piece in this triphasic model is process the trauma. And I use a number of different exercises. Again, they're in my books, and they're referred to in a lot of the materials that I've written. Things like layering, timed reflection, leaning in with compassion, thematic map and release. These are just various approaches we use for actually processing trauma. And they're powerful approaches because they're not simply talk therapy. See, we process traumas and life experiences in kind of graphical, imaginal ways. So it goes beyond just, I hope you feel better, Ande.
Right.
Or it has to go deeper than that, and it has to give us a different experience when confronting or sitting with or bearing witness to that which is unresolved, whether it's an actual trauma memory or a theme. You see how I'm splitting them up? Trauma memories. You could really do a lot of work on your trauma memories and still be left with themes. And those themes can continue to undermine how you function in this world today. And that's related to the infrastructure that I was talking about before. Those beliefs and kind of ways of navigating your life, right?
Hi, it's Ike again. I wanted to remind you once more that you can experience many more teachers in our free masterclass at AVAIYA.com/healing. That's AVAIYA.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
Yes. If the underlying theme is I'm unlovable, that is going to infiltrate and affect everything you would do in life, in the world of relationships and being worthy and all of that. So I can totally see how that affects everything. Do you have more to say about that?
Yeah. And I mean, finally, once we've really done our trauma processing, whatever approach you take, and I mean, there's many approaches available that are absolutely incredible, helpful. EMDR is one of them. I really, encourage people, if they are trying to figure out different ways of working, with trauma that, you know, you just do some searching around trauma processing, you'll find out a lot about what's current. And that, you know, I like somatic experiencing. I like things that actually engage the body, because, you know, that's where a lot of it lands. And, you know, all of the stuff that we do in the Traumatology Institute and training, you know, what we do is we look at the body, the mind, the way we're thinking, cognitions. Because remember, you know, you can think through something and I can think through something and we'll come to different conclusions. And, you know, what may cause trauma for you may not cause trauma for me. And we have to really be aware of this. Part of that is not just how it impacts the body, but our beliefs about the event itself.
Right.
Knowing what your pain points are and being able to lean towards those pain points, witnessing them with a friendly, gracious space can be the turning point in our lives. Because all of a sudden, you are now part of the solution and the evolution. And this is a kind of place of decision. It's like, what does it actually mean to lean towards? Like, if you're working with a really terrific therapist, that therapist will share the emotional space with you and help you be in it with kindness and compassion for yourself. You know, if you have a wonderful friend or a partner in life, then, you know, these are the people who will share these spaces. And that's part of the reason why relationships can be so therapeutic, because you look at somebody and you see kindness and space when you're sharing something that is a struggle for you. When you look at them and you see that kindness and space, no judgment, no need for you to change or stop talking about that thing, it creates a very receptive place for healing. And the other piece about, you know, when trauma does ignite, I would also encourage you all to think of it as, or receive it as, accept it inside of you as, so I'm talking about, you know, not just in your brain, your mind, but also in your heart. Accept it as a gift, because when something of a lower level happens and it ignites all the injuries, the unresolved places inside of you, now you know where the wound is. Now you know where you can place your focus, your attention, your kindness, and your care. You know, so as troubling as it can be to find ourselves, you know, facing and struggling with moments and memories that reignite earlier traumas, or maybe you've experienced something terrible today, stay connected with that place so that you can actually start to work with the raw emotions, right?
Oh, just such good stuff. I really appreciate this. This has been very enlightening, and I really do. I've talked to several people about how we need to bring it back to the body, and, you know, the somatics you were talking about, and making sure that we're feeling right, turning towards the pain points, right, leaning in, whatever, you know, it's so important. And often, so it just seems like a natural tendency for so many of us to turn away and run when it comes up, you know.
Right, for sure. There is always a tendency to recoil from that, or to stiffen around it. And then it just becomes like a kernel of poison within inside of ourselves that we're carrying around. And we never give ourselves the opportunity to really sit with that and bear witness and find space. And I mean, one of the exercises that I really like to work with when somebody's feeling like they're kind of stiffening around is an exercise around expanding emotions, where what we do is allow ourselves to really feel the raw emotions that we're carrying inside of us. And everybody has this, you know, something comes up, you know, if you have a moment where something spikes and you go like, I don't want to face that. But you're feeling it. And then you distract yourself and you recoil or you stiffen. And what ends up happening is nothing is resolved. We haven't used that as the gift that it is, which is here is that place of pain that is alive inside of me. Feel it. Feel the stiffening. And then you could even close your eyes and use your imagination and picture that the emotions, instead of being constricted, are having breath moving into them and are expanding, let's say, even to the size of the room that we're sitting in right now. And then allow yourself to breathe in and breathe out into the emotions and let them become even bigger so that they spill out into the entire space of the building that you're in, pushing into all of the rooms, into the window space and beyond, spilling out the windows, spilling into the city block you're in, the city that you're in, or beyond if you're in a country setting, and just expanding to their absolute maximum so that they are diffusing into the molecules of the air around us. And just noticing what happens inside of you as you allow yourself to see, and you've got your eyes closed, Ande, so I think you're letting yourself have that experience for a moment as you breathe in and you breathe out, just noticing what the experience is for you. And then very slowly bringing yourself back in, fully landing, breathing in and breathing out. And when you're ready, just bring your awareness back and open your eyes. And I want you to just tell me what you noticed. I think you joined along with that explanation.
Yeah, I love doing that. It like, I guess the experience was, whatever I was feeling was kind of tight and constricted. And then in letting it spill out the windows and letting it spill out into the countryside and over to the ocean and all of that, it really, to me, it just kind of dissipated after a while. I felt it much more strongly in the beginning, and then allowing it to expand just made it kind of not as intense. That was my experience of it.
Did you notice what the feeling of pressure was before you started that exercise? Like what the pressure felt like?
It was kind of in my chest and lower neck, and it was just kind of a dull pressure.
Yeah, so that would tell you that, I mean, it's interesting because you're staying with the inner experience rather than going to a story, which is really powerful, because the minute we start going into a story, it whips us up into a frenzy of, remember the bees, all the things that are on that chain, right? Everything. Right. So it's like, well, I feel this way because this happened and this happened and this happened. And it's like, it creates kind of a really churning, terrible inner experience. So you stayed right with the emotion and with the pressure. And as long as you don't go into your brain and all the stories that happen, you could really work with the raw emotion, which is what you did. And that's, then you really have access to allowing things to dissipate, which is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And the story doesn't have to be the thing that is driving everything in your life. That's not to say that at some point working on a story might not be helpful. It may be very, very beneficial, but you were able to just go with the raw emotion, which is just fabulous.
Well, yeah. Thank you. And I hope everyone watching right now also, you go through that exercise, and even if you rewatch this, you go through it again and see what's there for you and your experience of the exercise. That was beautiful. Thank you.
It's really been a delight to speak with you, Ande, and talk about this and share this.
Well, right back at you. I really appreciate it and all the work that you're doing in the world. And are there any last insights? I mean, we went through so much, but I'm sure we could talk for hours. Any last insights you want to leave people with before we wrap up?
Well, I would just say if people are interested in, working on some of the exercises or want to learn more, first, take the approach of being gentle with yourself, following your own kind of wisdom, because you do have wisdom, and, you do need to be paying attention to yourself, that if strong emotions come to the surface, choose to bear witness in a way that will be nourishing for you, that will be gentle for you. And you know that this is a journey. It doesn't all have to happen today. It's something that you peel back the layers one little bit at a time, and that is generally the best approach, one gentle layer at a time.
I love it. Thank you. I love it. I love your work. I love your message, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you so much, Ande.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into Anna's class, and we'll see you on the next one. Everybody, here is to your journey to healing from childhood trauma. Bye, everybody. Hey, everyone. I just wrapped up another incredible class with Dr. Anna Baranowsky, and she talked with us about gifts of your trauma past. So I really loved her class. I think she really has a very calming, soothing way about her. And she's been doing this work with PTSD and trauma for so long. And it really shows. I think some of the big take-home messages for me were when she talked about, really when she grabbed the beads and showed us this physical representation of how trauma and events in our lives can just string together and do string together throughout our lives. So any current thing that happens to us today, or a reminder of something that happened to us in the past, or some kind of a trigger, can stir up all those beads in the string, right? They're all linked together. And she's like, right, if you shake one, you're shaking them all. So I thought this was like a really cool way to visualize how we can get triggered by something that has nothing to do with potentially what happened in the past, or maybe it does, but it might not have anything to do with it. And it can shake everything up. All these past experiences can shake us up. So she recommended that we take a look at historical wounds that are unresolved. And specifically what she talked about with this was really like putting them out on a timeline and being precise with your language. So using 7 to 10 words to describe whatever that event was. So being really clear and concise and precise about what that was, and then rating them all, and then eventually like finding the themes on all of them. So the themes she mentioned were things like I'm unlovable, or life is unfair, or I'll always be alone, or I'll always be poor. You know, these are main like life themes. And I kind of look at them as like big underlying beliefs in life that you might have that if unresolved are going to affect and underlie everything that you do in your life and affect relationships and all of that stuff. So last thing I wanted to mention was how important Anna mentioned it is to witness our pain points with compassion. Right, to turn towards those pain points, to lean towards them, because, you know, like the exercise she just took us through, which I thought was so beautiful, is, you know, recognizing whatever the emotion is that you're experiencing, whatever pain or discomfort you're experiencing. And then she walked us through this really beautiful exercise of really allowing yourself to feel it and letting it, you know, pour out and get bigger. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Because so many of us want to run from something uncomfortable that we're feeling or something from the past. But what she recommended, right, was let it get bigger, let it get huge, let it spill out the windows, let it spill out the doors, let it spill out into the area that you're in, into the woods, into the city, whatever. And then my experience of doing that exercise with her was what I was experiencing was just dissipated. It was like having this amazing experience of feeling it and allowing it, looking at it and leaning towards it with compassion, like she said. And then the experience I had was it dissipated. So what was your experience of that? You know, what was your experience of doing that exercise, and how can you start applying that exercise in your life when you're experiencing these different emotions that you might want to run from, but the thing to do is to dive into them and turn towards them. So I hope that you enjoyed this latest class with Anna, and we will see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.